Is this the land of the gods?
Yoko Taro is a rather eccentric artist. That much is evident to fans of his work, but despite always pushing boundaries and trying new things, there are some notable trends that seem to bind his works together. From larger themes of suffering and despair, existentialism and nihilism, to smaller details like the presence of twins and angelic script, there is a paradoxical consistency to his work that truly rewards those who choose to dig deeper. Thanks to the success of Nier Automata, Taro's unique brand of grotesque beauty has been elevated out of the depths of obscurity. Unfortunately, his prior works have a notably steeper barrier to entry due to their less refined gameplay mechanics, to put it gently. This video will be discussing Taro's full catalog in depth, so at least a cursory knowledge of Drakengard 1 and 3 as well as both Nier games may be necessary to follow along. However, if you find yourself lacking in personal experience with any particular game in the series, rather than require you to tackle the potentially difficult task of completing one of his earlier games, I would like to recommend another channel called Clemps. Clemps has concise and rather entertaining story recaps of all 4 of Taro's games, and in fact raises a question in his series on Automata that ended up inspiring me to make this video. Needless to say, from here forward there will be complete spoilers for Drakengard 1 and 3, Nier, and Nier Automata. One of the smaller recurring details in Taro's games is a reference to flowers. Though Drakengard 1 lacks this to my knowledge, Nier introduced a flower called a lunar tear, which was said to be extremely rare and capable of granting a wish. In stark contrast to this, a flower, or perhaps I should say the flower, is a world-destroying entity that serves as the ultimate antagonist of Drakengard 3. Nier Automata, finally, not only brings back the lunar tear in Emil's garden, but Anemone and her former comrades such as Dahlia and Lily are all obviously named after flowers. The question that Clemps asked that inspired me to make this video is, why? Does Yoko Taro just like flowers? Is there some symbolic meaning to them, such as beauty or fragility? Or is there no reason at all? Clemps didn't offer an answer to this question, but I immediately had my thoughts. The first thing that came to mind when posed with this question was a lore explanation. Chronologically, Drakengard 3 occurs first in Taro's multiverse, with the flower serving as the focal point. The flower infects the game's protagonist, Zero, and, to gloss over the details, eventually spawns the Red Eye disease, which leads to the Cult of the Watchers in Drakengard 1. At the end of Drakengard 1, the Queen Beast is sent through a dimensional rift to modern-day Tokyo, bringing the Red Eye disease along with it. Due to the effect the disease has on humans, this brought about both the Legion and the White Chlorination Syndrome pandemic, eventually necessitating the enactment of the Gestalt Project. After the Gestalt Project's failure and the extinction of humanity, an alien race came to inhabit the Earth. The aliens manufactured machines which were all connected to a central network intelligence which, due to various circumstances, came to be particularly fixated on studying and replicating humanity. In their attempts to do so, they inadvertently replicated the Red Eye disease as well, which manifested as the Logic virus. Still with me? Good. If any of that was confusing, don't worry. Most of those details aren't actually important beyond illustrating my point. Point being, the flower was the source of every conflict in the Taroverse. But while that may explain things from a story perspective, that doesn't really provide a satisfactory answer to our question for a couple big reasons. Firstly, Drakengard 3 was Taro's third game, making it a somewhat retroactive explanation. More importantly, however, is that this answer only provides a surface-level explanation. I'm not trying to figure out why flowers keep popping up in Taro's games, but why Taro keeps putting flowers in his games. Which leads me to the second thing that came to my mind. Flowers have many different symbolic meanings, some of which Clemps guessed at. But for me, the most obvious thing a flower might represent is reproduction. But what significance would reproduction have across all of Taro's games? This is where my first thought comes into play. You see, if the flowers were there to represent reproduction, given that the flower not only serves as the antagonist of Drakengard 3, but also the catalyst for the events of the whole series, then reproduction should have some thematic significance to the antagonists of all of Taro's games. Is there any evidence to support this? Oh. Oh. Huh. Yeah, I might be onto something here. So let's start with the most obvious example, Drakengard 1. Drakengard 1 has the Queen Beast taking the form of a colossal pregnant woman, the Watchers, also known as Grotesqueries, taking the form of giant babies, and also worth mentioning are the Seeds of Destruction, or Seeds of Resurrection, which, beyond the obvious moniker of seed, also take the form of giant eggs. Drakengard 3 not only has the flower itself, but also the fact that the flower infected Zero, who was a former sex worker. When Zero tried to kill herself, the flower multiplied in self-defense, spawning 5 more women with the flower's power. Also, Zero had actually died before the flower infected her body, which brought her back to life. Now, resurrection isn't quite the same thing as reproduction, but it is perhaps at least worth mentioning. Nier is certainly the most subtle example. The primary example of reproduction, or perhaps I should say replication, here is in the Gestalt project itself, which through some unknown means was able to replicate the bodies of humans which had had their souls turned into shades. This dichotomy of reproduction and replication persists through Automata, but they ultimately represent the same thing, the perpetuation of life. More on that later. Also, I'd like to point out that although it's a minor example at best, in the Gestalt version of the game, the father-daughter relationship between Nier and Yona could be seen as a thematic example of reproduction as it pertains to the Shadow Lord and Shade Yona. In Automata, you see a combination of reproduction and replication represented. In the early game, there is the scenario in which the machines try to simulate human reproduction by mimicking sex, and of course shortly afterward you see the machines combine to form, let's just call it a birthing pod for lack of a better description, which gives birth to Adam and subsequently Eve. On a broader scale, however, the entire operation of the machine network functions out of a singular desire to replicate humanity. Also, aliens. So, it's pretty clear that themes of reproduction and replication permeate Taro's works, particularly with regard to the antagonists or conflict. But still the question remains, why? Well, as I said before, these themes of reproduction and replication represent the perpetuation of life as well as its repetitive nature. The framing of these ideas as antagonistic helps to illustrate some of the existential struggles each game tries to face. But perhaps most interestingly is how the conclusions that are presented in each game have evolved and arguably matured over time. Let's start from the beginning. Drakengard 1 presents a wretched world comprised entirely of violence and suffering. The protagonist, Kaim, as well as you, the player, seem to be trying to do as the hero always does, save the world. You fight battle after fruitless battle trying to protect the 4 magical seals warding off the coming of the enigmatic Watchers, who shall bring the apocalypse. But after the seals are broken, you are presented with something bizarre. The Watchers arrive in the form of giant babies, led by an even larger pregnant mother. This is generally considered the most disturbing part of the game, which is quite deliberate. The babies are even dubbed Grotesqueries by the game, and the mother is known as the Queen Beast. Think about this in a broader context, however, and that actually may seem quite odd. Through the course of the game, you have witnessed acts of cannibalism, pedophilia, suicide, incest, and mass murder. In fact, you yourself have slaughtered thousands, including children. Yet somehow these symbols of life still end up feeling so much more revolting. Don't get me wrong, this was certainly by design, but I feel this particular juxtaposition was as well. Drakengard's world is an embodiment of nihilism. It is an irredeemable world where you are capable of nothing but violence and suffering is inescapable. Life and suffering are intertwined. They are one and the same. As such, the perpetuation of life becomes the enemy. Its defeat the only hope for release. This nihilistic outlook stems from a sense of hopelessness and is a symptom of depression. It is a logic process that can and does lead to suicide. Has Taro struggled with this himself? I don't know, but it's very clear that he understands this. I do believe the purpose of Drakengard 1 is to portray these feelings and thoughts as the horrors that they are. He offers no solace, just morbid sincerity. This process is taken to its logical conclusion in the game's semi-final ending, where the world is consumed in a timeless void, offering no opportunity for redemption, no life, no pain, just peace at all costs. Taro's second game was notably more complex, with subtleties that are a bit more difficult to discern. The world of Nier wears a facade of hopefulness thinly veiled over inevitable tragedy. At its center, our story revolves around dual perspectives of the same man, each aligned on opposite ends of the spectrum from determination to denial. The Gestalt project sought to preserve humanity through an artificial replication process, but ultimately the heart of this effort lies with Nier himself. On one side of the coin, we have a father determined to do whatever it takes to save his daughter. On the other, we have a man refusing to accept her loss. These two sides are not equivalent, however. One is a false hope, the other a harsh truth. Nier is a story about how refusal to accept loss will lead one to hurt others and ultimately themselves. Nier, the real Nier, through his obsessive need to keep Yona alive, inflicted a millennium of purgatorial suffering on humanity, her, and himself. His replicant, faced with the same tragedy, commits acts of genocide upon the Gestalt humanity, ultimately leading to their extinction, all while the replicant race, having developed wills of their own, are inflicted with their own terminal plague. This madness is only brought to an end when Yona, the real Yona, finally refuses the fate her father had forced upon her and allows herself to die. Her father is killed by his own replicant, signaling the end of humanity. Replicant Nier has rescued his daughter from his perceived foe, but her illness is left uncured and the replicant race, lacking their own means of reproduction, are doomed to their own imminent end. But this story isn't quite over. Due to the collapse of Gestalt life, Kaine, Nier's closest companion, is overtaken by her Shade symbiote and fated to perish. Nier, a replicant of a man who doomed humanity through his insistence on perpetuating a life whose time had long since passed, is faced yet again with imminent loss, and a choice. He may accept her fate and allow her to die with dignity, or he may save her through sacrifice of not only his own life, but all memory of his existence. Ultimately, tragically, he chooses the latter. The idea that the world would be better off had you never lived seems like defeatist hyperbole to most, but is an idealized conclusion to those unable to cope with loss as a part of life. In indulging this fantasy, we are left with yet another mask of false heroism, denying a bitter, ugly truth. Drakengard 3 continues with this theme in a more overt manner. I believe Drakengard 3 serves as a deconstruction of ideations of heroic suicide. Having accepted that life and suffering are intertwined, there proceeds from which the possibility of perceiving oneself by nature of being alive as an active perpetuator of suffering. This leads to an intense self-loathing that would bring one to view ending their own life as a noble act, perhaps even their responsibility. This struggle against the reality of life and suffering is so clearly portrayed through Zero's struggle against the flower. Zero has a hatred for the life given to her by the flower, a life she never asked for. She sees this flower, this symbol of life, as a solely destructive force for which she serves as its harbinger. Through her intense need to spare the world from the pain she foretells, she succeeds only in inflicting far more of her own making. Zero sees herself as bearing this responsibility to the world, but the suffering of humanity, much like the flower itself, is a far greater force than any individual. The power to inflict suffering is bestowed upon all who are given life, and all will inevitably manifest that power. Drakengard 3 illustrates the result of the individual's refusal to accept this innate part of themselves and make peace with it. Finally, Automata offers a distillation of the principal conflict addressed by its predecessors. Every facet of Automata's story attempts to assess what life even means to us as humans, and determine whether or not its continued existence is even justifiable. The main idea that most of the game's conflicts and philosophy is centered around is the concept of purpose, particularly in its artificiality and impermanence. Everything in this game is artificial. The machines, Yorha, the Council of Humanity, Adam, and Eve all spawned from the machine network. Through this network and through each of its unique branches, a singular question is asked with several conclusions. What is humanity? For Yorha, it is a god to fight for. For the various disconnected machines, it is a civilization to emulate. For Adam, it is death. For Eve, it is family. And for the machine network itself, it is conflict. These various conclusions serve to illustrate the arbitrarity and artificiality of the things that give us purpose as humans. The main characters of this game are forced to confront this artificiality in dealing with the inherent impermanence of their chosen purpose. Though Adam achieves his ideal through his own death, Eve is then left without his brother, Pascal's village is destroyed and the robot children kill themselves out of fear, and 9S learns of humanity's extinction and is also faced with the death of 2B. All of these events force these characters to confront the challenge of life after purpose, which leads us to the concept of the cycle. Prior games had all dealt with repetition in more subtle ways, but Automata brings it to the forefront. Repetition permeates Automata to a fundamental degree, with 2B even lamenting it in the game's introduction.
Everything that lives is designed to end. We are perpetually trapped in a never-ending spiral of life and death. Is this a curse? Or some kind of punishment? I often think about the god who blessed us with this cryptic puzzle, and wonder if we'll ever have the chance to kill him.
The cycle represents life's repetitive and often tedious nature, which is why these concepts of reproduction and replication are so significant. Life and humanity are built around cycles, the life of the individual being composed of the day-by-day cycle, and the life of humanity composed of the cycle of birth to death. We are able to endure these cycles out of determination to our purpose, but with loss of purpose, the individual is easily overwhelmed by dread. This is the driving force behind 9S's descent into madness. Without purpose, 9S finds himself unable to accept the inevitable suffering of life and endure the cycle. What is overlooked in despair, however, is the very thing the machine network had been trying to discern: humanity's ability to manifest value. As humans, we define our own purpose. This artificiality of purpose is what allows us to endure the dread that accompanies its impermanence. Through their varied attempts to understand humanity, the machine network had unknowingly replicated this, but in the end, it is the pods that come to understand it. They allow the cycle to continue to afford our characters the opportunity to create new purpose for themselves, however arbitrary. Ultimately, the results may never change. These things we create for ourselves inevitably come and go just as we do. But if we don't endure the cycle, the treasures that give us purpose will never be allowed to bloom. From the beginning, Taro has never been afraid to tackle dark or taboo subject matter. In fact, he has consistently embraced it. But rather than use these themes to shock the viewer, they have always been used as tools to explore real struggles that people commonly face but aren't comfortable talking about. In much the same way, his trend of framing life and its perpetuation as antagonistic has always been used to express a difficult, often unspoken truth about life. Life is a struggle, and it is painful and frequently pointless. These battles that we face as individuals are all too often fought unspoken. Taro's games serve to counteract this. They proclaim boldly and uncomfortably these difficult truths. Life is a challenge you will face again and again, and you will fail again and again. It will hurt you and break you and leave you asking why. Ultimately, though, these challenges offer you an opportunity to grow into something beautiful. Thanks for watching.
Then you're